Welcome back to Alien Love Stories. Tonight's tale is strange, fragrant, a little bit dangerous, and smells like regret, roses, and maybe interstellar cinnamon. But let me ask you this. Have you ever fallen for someone so fast that even your bones wanted to hold the door open for them? I have. And worse than that, so did every other sentient creature within a 6-block radius. But let me start from the beginning. It was supposed to be a normal date. That's how these things always begin, right? Swipe left, swipe right, awkward messages, mild stalking of her profile where her eyes looked too real for Photoshop, and her smile felt like it had depth, like it knew something the rest of us didn't. Her name? Iliya. Her bio said, intergalactic exchange, culinary empath, perfume hobbyist, recovering conqueror, JKL. I thought the last line was a joke. It wasn't. We agreed to meet at a quiet little place in downtown Zephyria, somewhere between Earth fusion cuisine and atmospheric mood dining. It had just the right amount of gravity for romance, and the ambient playlist was mostly acoustic covers of black hole collapses. I arrived early, ordered tea, tried to pretend my hands weren't sweating. Then she walked in, and time paused. No, seriously. Time paused. The waiter froze mid-pour. A couple arguing at the bar stopped mid-sentence and began smiling dreamily at each other like nothing was wrong. The lighting dimmed itself by 7%. The automatic door forgot how to function and stayed wide open, inviting every breeze and leaf and startled pigeon from the street to drift inside, like they, too, had fallen for her. And her? She floated, not literally. But somehow every step she took rearranged the molecules in the room to make space for her presence. Her dress shimmered. Her eyes had galaxies in them. And the moment she passed the bar, everyone turned their heads and bowed. I mean it. The cook bowed from the kitchen window. The ceiling fan slowed to an elegant spin like it didn't want to be noisy in front of her. The waitress dropped a tray and whispered, "She's here." And me? I barely remained seated. I tried to stand, but my knees wobbled. Not from awe, from something more primal, something chemical, something fragrant. The scent hit me like a lullaby wrapped in memory. It wasn't perfume exactly, it was presence. A smell so soft, so subtle, that I didn't register it until I noticed my pulse sinking to the rhythm of her footsteps. She smiled at me across the room, tilted her head, and the scent changed. Now it smelled like home, which was weird, because I've never smelled my childhood bedroom and stardust in the same note before. She sat, and I, against all conscious effort, stood and offered her my chair. She giggled, took my hand instead. And the moment our skin touched, the walls glowed, just faintly, but enough for the host to say, "Ah, a recognized pairing. Very good. You may proceed to the resonance booth." The resonance booth was usually reserved for anniversary couples or diplomatic pairings. I tried to protest. We just met." The host blinked, then bowed to Iliya. "My apologies. I assumed, based on her field." I turned to her. "Field?" She shrugged. "Must be the perfume. I mixed it myself." She smiled. And I swear I almost proposed on the spot. We entered the booth. Low lighting, harmonic seating, a table that adjusted to the emotional tone of the couple. And still, that scent lingered. It wasn't overpowering. It was curious. It changed depending on what I felt. And every time I got nervous or distracted or unsure, it shifted back to comfort, like it was soothing me, or guiding me, or, I don't know, rewiring my sense of self. By the time our appetizers arrived, I realized I hadn't blinked in 3 minutes. She laughed when I said that. "Don't worry," she said. "It's just the blend. I call it compulsion number." Yeti, I laughed too, until I saw the waiter kneeling beside her. Not in pain, in devotion. He whispered, "My lady, may I refresh your drink?" She blinked, looked at me, then back at him. Sure?" He took her empty glass, held it above his head like it was a relic, and walked backward out of the booth like he was leaving a holy shrine. I turned to her. "Is this normal for you?" She bit her lip. Not usually. And then I looked outside and noticed something strange. Everyone in the restaurant was facing us, not in fear, in awe. People had stood up, stared. One person outside had their forehead pressed against the window, and when I squinted, I realized he was weeping. Not out of sadness, out of something I couldn't name, out of adoration. Iliya didn't notice. She just reached for my hand, touched my wrist, smiled, and said, "I'm so glad I met you tonight." And the moment she said that, my mind flared, my spine tingled, and I thought I would do anything for her. The booth lights pulsed, the table grew warm, and somewhere deep inside me a voice whispered, "That wasn't your thought." You ever do something and then realize halfway through, wait, this wasn't my idea? Yeah, that was me, folding linen napkins at 3:17 a.m. into cursive letters that spelled out Iliya on my bedroom floor like some lovesick monk who got hired by a wedding planning cult. The weird part? I wasn't even surprised, not until I blinked and realized I had absolutely no memory of where the napkins came from or how long I'd been doing it. I just looked down, saw her name stitched into space like a devotional offering, and whispered aloud, "What the hell is happening to me?" And the napkins whispered back, "Okay, not really, but emotionally, yes." Let me rewind. After our first date, Iliya had kissed my cheek goodbye. 1 second of warmth, scent, and the softest sigh I'd ever felt grazed my skin. And suddenly the entire sidewalk tilted under me like the world had just found a new center of gravity. And her perfume was it. I don't even remember getting home. All I recall is smiling at my bedroom lamp for being soft enough for her presence, then bowing slightly to my refrigerator because I felt like it deserved acknowledgement. You know, normal post-date behavior. The next morning, things escalated. I woke up to 48 unread messages on my wristpad from friends, co-workers, and one guy I hadn't spoken to in 8 years, all saying the same thing. Who was she? Where did you meet her? I dreamed about her, and I've never even seen her face. I wrote a poem in my sleep. It rhymed. I hate rhyming. Is she hiring? That last one was from my landlord, and I hadn't told anyone about the date. I stepped out of my apartment. The hallway smelled like roses, amber, and the warmth of forgiven arguments. People were gathered at my door. My neighbor, who usually grunted instead of speaking, looked at me and said, "You saw her." It wasn't a question, it was a confession. And I, like a man possessed, nodded, because he was right. I had seen her, and the memory was now living inside me like a song I couldn't stop humming. I got to work 30 minutes late. No one noticed. They were too busy drawing abstract hearts into their hollow screens. One guy in accounting was crying while sniffing a silk handkerchief he swore he'd never owned. Another was just whispering, "Her, her, her," like a mantra into his coffee mug. I tried to focus, but my hands, they had other plans. They kept rearranging my desk into concentric circles, around a central point, where I accidentally placed a photo of her I didn't remember taking, which was extra strange, because the photo was from an angle I couldn't have captured unless I was levitating. And I'm pretty sure I can't levitate. Yet. Around noon, my boss pulled me aside. He looked soft, malleable, like a marshmallow that had recently experienced emotional clarity. He said, "We've canceled all meetings today. The team needs time to process." Process what? He sighed. The scent, it's everywhere. It's like love finally got tired of waiting and made itself into something breathable. Then he handed me a package, wrapped in crimson silk, no return address. I opened it. Inside, a small glass bottle. No label, just one note, handwritten in glittering ink. "So you don't forget me." I didn't spray it. I didn't have to. The bottle itself emitted memory. Just holding it made my chest ache like someone had hugged me too tightly inside a childhood I never had. My hands trembled. I looked at my boss. He was already kneeling, not to me, to the bottle. I left the office. Back at home, the napkin folding resumed, but now it was involuntary. My hands moved on their own. My lips whispered lyrics I'd never learned. and I started designing a room. For her, a room I didn't know how to build. But my body knew. My mind followed. A chamber of fragrance and silence. A throne of velvet made from apology. An altar made of longing. I stopped only when my legs gave out. I texted her. Me. Are you doing this? She replied instantly. Iliya. I don't know what you mean. Iliya. Are you okay? Iliya. I think I need to see you again. My breath caught, not from the words, from the wave of obedience that crashed over me the moment I read them. My body stood. I didn't ask it to. It just did. That night, we met again. Same restaurant, same table, same lighting that now knew her name. She looked radiant, terrified. She said, I need to tell you something. And I, smiling, nodding, folding napkins even as she spoke, whispered back, anything, my lady. And deep inside me, a single part of my soul screamed, you don't even talk like that. There's something terrifying about smiling without meaning to. Not the polite kind, not the social, I'm fine kind. I'm talking about the kind of smile that wraps itself around your face like a mask dipped in warm honey, soft, sweet, but not yours. That's what happened when Iliya walked into the restaurant again. I smiled, automatically, reflexively, like my body wanted to prove something to her that I hadn't agreed to yet. And she noticed. She tilted her head, frowned, said, that's not your smile. And I, still smiling, nodded and whispered, no, it's yours. She took my hand, not like a lover, not like a date, but like someone trying to stop a wildfire from burning down a forest they planted. Her eyes searched mine. Are you okay? She asked. I meant to say yes, but instead I said, I exist for you. She flinched, and for the first time, Iliya looked afraid. We sat, same booth, same table. This time, the restaurant had dimmed its lights before she arrived. The chef was already plating dishes we hadn't ordered. One waiter was on his knees whispering a prayer I couldn't quite hear, but somehow understood. May her scent be gentle upon the wind. May her footsteps guide the lost. May her presence not burn too brightly today. Iliya shivered. I held her hand across the table. Or maybe my hand held itself. She spoke low. I didn't mean for this to happen. I nodded, because what else could I do? She leaned in. I need to tell you something, but you have to promise me you'll listen. I would die for your words, I said. She shut her eyes, whispered, that's not romantic. That's the perfume talking. I didn't blink, didn't breathe, just nodded again. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a small vial, the same shape as the one she sent me. But this one, it pulsed, not with light, with memory. She placed it on the table between us. The table bent slightly, not physically, but emotionally, as if even the furniture knew what this vial meant. She said, this was made by accident. I stared at it. She continued, my grandmother was part of a guild. They were scent casters, emotional chemists, not witches, not mages, just artists who understood that memory could be distilled. I nodded. She glanced around. Everyone in the restaurant had frozen, not because of her, because of the vial. A single drop of fragrance was leaking, and the room had paused to feel it. One couple held hands across a table they hadn't reserved. A child pressed his face into a menu and began humming. The hostess cried, softly. Iliya whispered, this is Formula 37, a blend never meant to exist. One that awakens emotional magnetism. Magnetism? She nodded. It syncs emotional intention with subconscious projection. If I feel something strongly enough, the world obeys. She winced. People obey. Space listens. Memory rearranges. And you wore it? She swallowed. By mistake. I thought it was my grandmother's old day scent. I wore it to remind me of her. Why doesn't it affect you? It does, just not the same way. We sat in silence, the room still holding its breath. Then softly I asked, do you feel something for me? She froze, didn't answer, and that was answer enough, because at that exact moment, The lights dimmed further. The booth became softer, and every plant in the restaurant turned to face her. I looked at her, then down at my own hands, which had begun braiding the napkins into hearts again, without permission, without instruction, just need, pure, scented need. Iliya buried her face in her palms. "This isn't love," she whispered. I whispered back, "It's enough." She shook her head violently. "It's not real. You're not choosing this. You didn't wake up today wanting to braid napkins into my name." I tried to say, "Yes, I did." But my tongue refused. It was done lying. She stood up suddenly, and the room gasped. Not the people, the room. Walls shimmered. Chandeliers tilted ever so slightly toward her. A beam of light from outside bent through the window like it had been waiting for her exit cue. She whispered, "I have to go." I whispered back, "Don't." And from somewhere behind me, a voice broken and unsure called out, "Please stay. My wife left me 12 years ago. Your scent makes me believe she's still waiting." Another voice, "I haven't cried in decades. Please just walk by again." Iliya ran. The room wept. I chased her. Of course I did. Every nerve in my body begged for it. Outside, she collapsed onto the sidewalk. Not dramatically, just exhausted. The air around her shimmered. Pedestrians had stopped. They stood still, watching her like disciples waiting for a sermon. I approached. She didn't look at me, just said, "You have to help me stop this." I knelt beside her, placed the vial back in her hand, asked, "What happens if you never wear it again?" She looked at me and said something I didn't expect. "I don't need to wear it. It lives in me now." And that's when I felt it. A pulse, a ripple, across the entire city block. Streetlights flickered, a dog bowed, a taxi driver wrote a haiku, and from above, 3 satellites rotated in sync, then tilted toward her. She stood, took my hand, and whispered, "We have to leave before it spreads." I nodded, but deep inside a question echoed. Or has it already? They told us the planet was quiet, peaceful, a vacation world with a 92% air happiness rating, 6 moonlight speos per square kilometer, and absolutely no history of mass hysteria. Perfect for laying low, or so we thought. We landed on Iliya, a little sapphire of a world orbiting twin suns that never fought. Everything here glowed slightly. The plants breathed, the rivers sang, the birds harmonized with background music. Even the wind apologized if it blew your hair out of place. And for about 8 seconds after we landed, it was quiet. Then Iliya stepped off the ship, and the world exhaled. It started with petals falling from trees that hadn't been in bloom in over a decade, according to the onboard scanner. They floated gently down, spinning like dancers in slow gravity, and made a soft whispering sound as they passed us. Then came the sound, a hush, but not silence, a collective intake of breath. And then, from the stone path leading away from the landing zone, they bowed, dozens of them, then hundreds, civilians, security bots, vendors holding bags of dream fruit, children holding glowing balloons, all of them, on their knees, heads bowed, eyes closed, arms outstretched like supplicants greeting the second sunrise. And from somewhere above us, the wind carried a word, just one, software, repeated, synchronized. "Beloved," I looked at Iliya. She looked at me, then at the crowd, and back to me. "I didn't spray anything," she whispered. "I swear." I nodded, jaw clenched, because I believed her. This wasn't a chemical accident anymore. It was devotion, instinctual, spiritual, frighteningly pure. Her presence now resonated like a sacred chord struck across the heartstrings of sentient minds. Iliya took a single step forward. The crowd gasped, not because they were afraid, because they were in awe. A priest emerged, tall, robed, antennae twitching with reverence. He carried a bowl of glowing mist and walked barefoot across hot stone, like pain didn't matter in her presence. He reached her, dropped to both knees, lifted the bowl to her face, spoke in a trembling voice. "We've waited for you." Iliya shook her head. No, I'm not who you think I am." But the bowl shimmered. The mist took shape. A face appeared. Her face, only older, wiser, crowned in moonlight. The crowd whispered again. She has returned. I tried to step between her and the priest, but my body froze. Not out of fear, out of reverence. Not mine, the world's. And I was just obeying. Iliya gripped my arm, whispered urgently, "We have to get out of here." But the moment she turned, the sky dimmed. Literally, the twin suns rotated away, not set, just shifted, so she would not be in harsh light. Shade followed her like loyalty. We ran, down the stone paths, through glowing gardens. The plants opened as we passed, releasing pheromones that made my memories feel like poetry. I was falling again, but this time I knew better, and that made it worse, because I couldn't resist, even when I wanted to. Even when I screamed silently in my mind, "Don't kneel, don't kneel, don't kneel." My knees bent anyway. We reached a building, small, hexagonal, shielded in reflective vines. She pulled me inside, slammed the door. Inside, silence, real blessed silence, except the vines on the walls pulsed in time with her breathing. She paced. "I can't be here. I'm a danger." I shook my head. "You're not dangerous." She looked at me, eyes blazing. "You built a napkin shrine to my name." I tried to smile. It was symmetrical. She didn't laugh. "I think it's evolved," she whispered. "Whatever was in the perfume, it's not just a scent anymore. It's a frequency, a presence. I walk in, and the world bends." I took a deep breath, let it out slowly. "Then we figure out how to unbend it," she scoffed. "You can't unring a bell, lover." I blinked. "You called me lover." She froze, realized it, then whispered, "Oh no." I stepped closer. "Wait, that means—" She nodded, tears welling. "It's not just them, is it?" I didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. The perfume didn't work unless she truly felt something, which meant this whole planetary devotion, this mass obedience, the suns rotating, the flowers weeping in her shadow. It was all because she loved me. I laughed. "Because what else do you do?" She smacked my arm. "Stop it! You loved me and accidentally conquered a planet. I didn't mean to. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me. I'm serious." "So am I." We both stared at each other, then laughed again and cried a little, because we were ridiculous and terrifying and cosmic and so cursed. Then the door knocked. 3 soft taps, a pause, then a voice. "Beloved, we prepared the throne." Iliya closed her eyes. "Of course they have." I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up, because the moment I opened my eyes, everything smelled like her again. Only different, diluted, filtered, as if the air had been trying to remember her scent, but got it just slightly wrong, like a melody played one note off, close enough to recognize, far enough to disturb you. I sat up. The walls were humming, software, soothing, like lullabies sung by a machine that once knew heartbreak. Iliya was gone. The throne room was empty. My head pulsed, not with pain, with resistance. The scent was fading, and for the first time in days, my mind was quiet. I stood. My legs wobbled like newborn thoughts. The door opened automatically. No guards, no kneeling followers, just silence and a hallway that smelled like memory loss. I walked, one step, then another, and with each step her presence weakened. Not my love, not my fear, just the compulsion. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall, cloaked, holding something in both hands, a box that pulsed blue. "Come with me," they said. I blinked. "What is this?" "No time." Their voice was metallic, layered, like multiple versions of themselves had agreed on this message before speaking. I followed, not because I trusted them, but because I trusted myself again. And that felt like a miracle. They led me through a hidden hatch, down a tunnel, into a small underground space filled with tech that looked both ancient and stolen. 7 others were waiting. Each wore a different face, a different species, a different kind of emptiness. But their eyes? Alive, awake. And for the first time since Iliya's perfume entered my bloodstream, I felt seen. "Welcome," one said. "We're the unperfumed." I blinked. "Is that a joke?" The one with the blue box chuckled. "Number, but it should be." Another with eyes like cracked glass stepped forward. "You're the last one." I frowned. The last what? The last conscious mind in the gravitational radius of her influence. I sat, mostly because my knees gave out. They handed me water. Real water. No aroma, no additives. Just neutral. It tasted like freedom. They told me everything. How Lyriv had once been a research colony for emotional resonance studies. How the world itself had been tuned to respond to emotional signals. Sorrow made the rain fall. Laughter could summon light. And then Iliya arrived, carrying with her an ancient perfume seed she didn't know had rooted itself in her cells. They'd seen this before. Once, centuries ago. The Rose Plague. A time when a woman cried, and 3 star systems drowned in collective mourning. "She doesn't know," I whispered. They nodded. "She does now, but it's too late." I felt my chest tighten. "She's not trying to control anyone. She doesn't have to." One of them opened a holomap. It showed planetary energy fields bending, literally warping around Iliya's last known location. "You don't understand," I said. "She wants to stop this. She's afraid of it." The cracked glass one stepped forward. "Then why hasn't she left?" I didn't have an answer, but the question lodged itself in my lungs like a splinter. They showed me footage of citizens kneeling at dawn, of entire schools singing lullabies about her kindness, of farmers naming their crops after her sighs, of pilots crashing into clouds on purpose, just to see if they could feel her breath. "She's a god now," the blue box one said. "Not by choice, but by consent." I closed my eyes, and in the silence I heard her voice again. "I didn't mean to." They handed me the box. "This will reset you, fully. If there are still any residual frequencies, this will clear them." I stared at it, then back at them. "You want to erase her from me?" They hesitated, then nodded. I looked down and whispered, "No." Gasps. Whispers. Someone muttered, "He's still under." But I shook my head. "I still love her. That's mine. That's real. And I won't kill it just because it's inconvenient." The cracked glass one sighed. "She's rewritten you." Number. "She's transformed me. But I'm still here." I stood, handed the box back. "But maybe I'm the only one who can remind her who she was." Before all of this, I turned to leave. The blue box figure stopped me. "If you go back, you might not return." I smiled. "Then I better bring her with me," and left. Outside, the scent returned. Software. Inviting. Like gravity wrapped in silk. My knees buckled. But I kept walking. Because love is not obedience. It's the choice to stand, especially when you're being pulled to your knees. The path back to her temple was paved in silence. Not literal silence, the wind still moved. The birds still sang their strange 2-note hymns. And yet, everything felt like it was waiting for me to arrive. Which was strange, because for the first time since this all began, I wasn't under her spell. I was walking on my own. Each step forward wasn't pulled by longing. It was pushed by purpose. That felt new. That felt dangerous. When I reached the temple gates, the guards parted without speaking. They wore robes of silk that shimmered like thoughts half remembered. And their eyes, empty, not vacant, just full of her. So full that there was no room left for anything else, not even themselves. I stepped inside. The temple glowed from within, not from electricity, from emotion. The walls were made of memory, the floor, forgiveness, and the ceiling. The ceiling looked like the sky the night she first smiled at me. It was beautiful and horrifying, because that meant the temple had been built from my memories of her. She sat on a throne made of rose-colored glass, eyes closed, breathing steady, surrounded by silent worshippers. I wanted to run to her, but I forced myself to walk, slow, measured. I crossed the bridge of reverent silence, and then she opened her eyes and looked at me. For a moment the world held its breath, and then she spoke. Software, beautiful, unrecognizing. Who are you? It hit harder than I expected, not because she'd forgotten me, but because she meant it, completely, genuinely. There was no flicker of recognition, no hidden smile, just calm, curious disconnection. I stepped forward. I'm the one who never knelt. She tilted her head. I see, one of the unscented. Unperfumed, I corrected gently. She smiled, politely, like you might smile at a child holding a stick and calling it a sword. You came to resist, she said. No, I said. I came to remember. She blinked. I saw it then. A flicker, a micro-expression, something old behind those star-glazed irises. I leaned in. You used to braid my hair with your fingers while I read to you in bed. Silence. You once told me fear tastes like the space between breaths. Nothing. You called me lover by accident. Her fingers twitched. The petals around the throne stirred. One of the worshippers gasped. I turned. She collapsed. Not from pain, from conflict. Iliya stood slowly, her presence pressed down like velvet gravity. She stepped toward me. Your words are dangerous. They're yours. No longer. She raised her hand, and I felt the pull, the scent, the command. My knees buckled, my spine arched. And just before I hit the ground, I said, I love you. That stopped her. Everything froze. The room, the air, the vines climbing the inner pillars, even the pulse of her aura. She whispered, You shouldn't. I smiled through the strain. I'd do anyway. She stepped closer. Why? Because the part of you that's buried under all this, that part still wants to be free. Her eyes widened, and for just one breath, just one, she looked like her. Then the scent thickened, not by choice, reflex. The perfume had become an organism. It sensed threat, emotionally. And I was a threat, not to her prison. I fell. The scent wrapped around me like a net of longing, and every memory I had of her, it turned against me. That smile, now it mocked me. That kiss, now it burned. That laugh, now it echoed like a ghost through a hallway of doubt. I screamed, not aloud, inside, and I heard it, a second scream, heron buried deep, a locked voice inside a fortress made of roses and worship and emotional gravity. And I knew she was still in there. I reached for her hand. She didn't move, but she didn't pull away. Do you remember the first night? I whispered. The resonance booth, the way the room sighed. Her fingers trembled. You wore red. I dropped my tea. You laughed. Her breath hitched, and for just a moment, a single tear slid down her cheek. It hit the ground, and the scent shifted, just slightly. Enough. Enough for me to stand. Enough for her to whisper, I'm sorry. The spell didn't break, not yet. But the glass of the throne cracked, a fault line across the seat of her godhood. And somewhere in the temple, a candle extinguished itself, by choice. The throne cracked again, just a hairline fracture. But I felt it, in the room, in the air, in her. Iliya's fingers trembled, her shoulders dipped, and for one brief, aching second, she looked like a person again. Not a goddess, not a celestial presence clothed in memory, just her. The girl who apologized when she laughed too hard. The girl who tried to cook eggs with lavender oil and made my kitchen smell like a botanical fever dream for a week. The girl who whispered, I don't know if I'm lovable, but I hope you stay anyway. She stared at the crack in the throne, then at me. I didn't want this, she said. I know. I only ever wanted to be held without hurting anyone. I stepped closer. You didn't hurt me. She shook her head. You don't understand. This perfume, it was meant to react to genuine emotional resonance. It was never just scent. It was response. Response to what? She looked up. To me. To love. The air trembled. The walls dimmed, as if the temple itself knew that truth had just entered the room and didn't quite know what to do with it. She whispered, "It only works if I feel something real." I froze, because in that moment, every moment made sense. Why the first date turned the room into a poem. Why the second made me braid napkins in my sleep. Why the planet bowed the second she stepped off the ship. It wasn't just about the formula. The perfume didn't create power. It amplified what was already there. She loved me, and that love, that fragile, beautiful thing, had become a weapon. Not because she wanted it to, but because the universe had never learned how to handle sincerity that deep. I should have stayed alone, she said, voice breaking. No, I said. You should have been seen and held and told it's okay to feel that much. Tears slid down her cheeks. The petals around the throne wilted. Not dramatically, just gently, like a garden letting go. The room reacted. The scent shifted. No longer heavy. Now, it smelled like the moment before a goodbye. Bittersweet, final. She stepped off the throne, walked to me, and touched my face. Her fingers were warm, still trembling. I can't be around you anymore, she said. My heart cracked where the throne had. Don't. I have to. If I stay, this world becomes mine. Then let it be. It wouldn't be me. It would be the part of me that loves you too much to let go. Then don't let go. She smiled, and in her smile, I saw everything. Love, grief, sacrifice, resolve. She pressed her forehead to mine, whispered, I'm going to forget you. I tried to pull away. No. She held me tighter. It's the only way to shut it off, to break the resonance link, to dissolve the signal. You don't have to. I do. Please. Loving you made me beautiful. Letting you go will make me human again. I didn't fight. Not really. Because somewhere deep down, I knew. She wasn't doing this to stop loving me. She was doing it to save me from what her love had become. She reached into her sleeve, pulled out a small silver pin, pressed it to her chest. There was a flash, software, a shiver in the room. And then, silence. The scent vanished, completely. I staggered, like my blood had lost its rhythm. She stepped back, looked at me, and said, Hello, I'm sorry, but do I know you? The world went still. I stared at her, and in that moment, I believed her, because the sparkle in her eyes was gone. So was the fear. So was the pull. So was us. I turned away, walked past the cracked throne, the kneeling followers, the vines that no longer pulsed, and I whispered, I love you. Not to change her, not to bring her back, just so the universe would know it. The first week was a blur. Not because I cried. I couldn't. It's hard to cry when you've been hollowed out so cleanly that even your tears feel like strangers in your own body. I stayed on Iliya. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped the scent would come back, that a breeze might carry a remnant of her memory, that I'd walk by a flower that trembled just a little too sweetly and say, there she is. But nothing came. The air was ordinary. The wind, well-mannered. The planet had exhaled and moved on. The temple remained, empty now. The petals that once glowed when she breathed had dried and fallen. Her throne, cracked and unoccupied, stood like a relic of a myth that no one told anymore. The worshippers, gone. Some whispered of a pilgrimage. Others forgot entirely why they'd gathered in the first place. That's what happens when you disappear a goddess. People either canonize you or erase you. I went to the marketplace for the first time 7 days after she forgot me. The vendors greeted me by name. They smiled, laughed. One even tried to set me up with his cousin, Apparently, she was a great cook, had 3 eyes, and didn't smell like dangerous memory triggers. Tempting, but I politely declined. I wandered, breathed, listened, watched, and then she walked past me, just like that, wearing a gray jacket too big for her shoulders, hair tied back, no makeup, no crown, just Iliya, shopping for fruit, comparing prices, smiling politely at a vendor, and then turning and walking right past me. Not a glance, not a blink, nothing. And still, my heart forgot how to beat, because even stripped of divinity, even dressed in civilian plainness, she moved like gravity had a favorite, like the world still wanted to lean toward her, even if she didn't ask anymore. I turned slowly, watched her walk. Her hand reached out, touched a glowing citrus orb. She sniffed it, wrinkled her nose, put it back. She chuckled to herself, and I thought, that laugh, it hadn't changed. I followed, at a distance, not like a stalker, like a historian chasing proof that a legend once walked. She stopped at a vendor selling tea. The merchant handed her a sample. She sipped, paused, sighed. "Reminds me of something," she said. The vendor tilted his head. "Of what?" She blinked, shook her head. "I don't know, but it feels like a goodbye I never got to say." I stepped behind a column, pressed my back against it, held my breath, and swallowed the scream. That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice. A goodbye I never got to say. Was that me? Was that a fragment? Or just coincidence? I didn't know, but something inside me stirred. A reckless hope, the kind that sneaks in when your logic is exhausted and grief forgets to close the door. So I did something stupid. The next day I returned to the marketplace, same spot, same time, and I bought a small vial of perfume, not hers, just something sweet. I dabbed it on my wrist, walked past her stall. She was there again, tasting fruit, laughing at a joke from the melon man. I passed by. She didn't turn, but she did pause, just for a breath. Her fingers twitched. Then she blinked, once sharply, as if a memory had tried to crash through a locked door. And then she shook it off, kept walking. I didn't follow. I didn't speak. I just stood there shaking. Because for that 1 second, her body remembered something her mind couldn't. Over the next few days, it became a ritual. I would pass by. She would pause. Once she smiled for no reason. Once she touched her wrist after I walked past. And once, just once, she whispered, "You again?" to no one in particular. And that's when I knew. She was starting to feel the shape of a ghost that wore my name. I began leaving little things near her path. A folded napkin, braided, like I used to do. She picked it up, held it, didn't know why, but smiled anyway. I left a tea bag, the same blend we shared on our second date. She sniffed it. Her eyes welled, but she didn't understand why. And I didn't explain, because this wasn't about reminding her. It was about her remembering herself. That night I wrote her a letter. Didn't sign it, didn't address it. Just one sentence. "You called me lover by accident." I left it where she'd find it. The next day, it was gone. And when I passed her in the street, she didn't look at me, but her lips moved, just barely. And the word they formed was, again. It was the soft kind of knock, the kind that isn't really a knock, more like a whisper wrapped in wood. I froze, tea halfway to my mouth, and for a moment, just one heartbeat. I let myself believe it was a delivery, or a neighbor, or a mistake. But I knew, even before I opened the door, even before I looked through the small screen and saw the silhouette, it was her, Iliya, wearing that gray jacket again, hair tied up, eyes wide, and in her hand, a napkin, braided, exactly like the ones I used to fold. I opened the door, didn't speak, neither did she. For a full 10 seconds, we just looked. Her eyes scanned my face like a memory flickering on the edge of sleep. Finally, she said, "I don't know why I'm here." I nodded, because that made 2 of us. But she wasn't done. She held up the napkin. "This is yours, right? I didn't answer. She blinked fast. I found it near the tea vendor, and her breath caught. I couldn't throw it away. I stepped aside, wordlessly. She hesitated, then stepped in. The door closed behind her, and the silence became something alive, not awkward, sacred. The silence of two people on the edge of remembering something they're not allowed to know. I gestured to the couch. She sat, clutched the napkin like it held the answers. I made tea. Of course I did, because what else do you offer someone who once ruled your heart like a sun with its own orbit? She sipped, paused, then looked up. This is familiar. I smiled, not with my mouth, with my entire nervous system, because that was the same blend we drank on our second date, the one where she'd accidentally touched my knee and apologized like she'd kicked me into hyperspace. You live alone, she asked. Yes. No family here? No. Friends? A few, but not the kind who bring soup when you're sick. She nodded slowly, then whispered, I feel like I've been here before. I looked at her, held her gaze, and said, You have. She froze, like the world just tilted slightly and her balance recalibrated. I have? Yes. When? I didn't answer, because if I told her, it wouldn't mean anything. But if she remembered, it would mean everything. She stood, walked slowly across the room. Her fingers brushed a photo frame. It was turned down. I hadn't looked at it in weeks. She picked it up, looked at it. It was blurry. Two people smiling, one with her hair, one with my posture. The kind of picture you take when you're trying not to look too in love. She whispered, This is me. Not a question, not a realization. Just a fact she couldn't unfeel. I nodded. She set the frame down gently, then turned. I have dreams about you. I swallowed. What kind? She shook her head. They're not clear, just pieces. Tea, laughter, the way your eyes close when you think too hard. She paused, then whispered, Your voice makes me sad. And I wanted to fall apart. Because what do you say to someone whose soul still aches for you, but whose mind has no blueprint for why? I reached out, gently touched her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she said, Every time I try to think about who I was before last week, it feels like there's a door. Just one, and it's locked. I squeezed her hand, softly. And now? She looked at me, tears in her eyes. It's creaking. We sat there in silence again. Not awkward, not sacred. This time, hopeful, frightened, tender. The kind of silence you share with someone whose soul is learning your name again. She finally whispered, I don't know who I am around you. I smiled. You're Iliya. Her breath caught. I don't remember being her. You don't have to. She remembers you. She stood, walked toward the door, paused, and asked, Can I come back tomorrow? I nodded. You can come back every day. She smiled. Small, wounded, beautiful. I don't know what we were, I nodded, but I want to find out. She left. And the moment the door closed, I sat on the couch and cried. Not because I was sad, not because I missed her, but because she came back. She came back the next day, then the day after that. No explanations, no questions. Just a gentle knock, a quiet smile, and the kind of presence that wraps around a room like sunrise. Gradual, golden, and absolutely impossible to ignore. We didn't talk about the past, not directly, but memory has a funny way of dripping through the cracks, even when the dam holds. She'd touch the edge of a mug, hold it for too long, smile at a song playing in the background like it was the punchline to a joke she almost remembered. And once, as she sat on the windowsill, watching the twin moons rise, she whispered, It feels like we've done this before. I didn't answer, because if I said yes, it might scare her, and if I said no, it might scare me. So I just nodded, poured her more tea, and let the silence carry the truth between us like a note suspended in air. On the third day, she offered to cook. I'm not great, she said, tying her hair back. I smiled. I'll survive. We stood in my kitchen, together. She chopped fruit. I stirred something that was supposed to be soup but smelled like existential confusion. Then she reached for the spice rack, hesitated, picked a small vial, opened it, and paused. She didn't speak, but her eyes glistened. Slowly, she brought it to her nose, sniffed, and blinked rapidly. Her fingers trembled. She set it down, backed away. I don't know what that is, she said, but it smells like a goodbye I never wanted. I froze. The vial was mine, old, buried at the back of the rack, a homemade blend she once made, joking that it was compulsion number Yedinshi. We never used it. She said it was too strong, too sad. Apparently it survived the purge. So did something in her. We sat down without eating. She looked at me and said very softly, "There's something inside me that wants to cry every time I'm near you." My throat tightened. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked. "No," she said instantly. "Do you want to stop coming?" "No." "Then what do you want?" She stared at her hands, then whispered, "I want to remember what made me feel like this in the first place." Later that night, as she stood to leave, she paused by the door. "I dreamed last night," she said, "about a garden with floating lights. I was barefoot. You were there." I swallowed. "That's not a dream," I said before I could stop myself. She turned, eyes wide. "It's not?" "No." "It happened?" "Yes." She stared at me for a long time, then nodded, very slowly. "Okay." And then she left. The next day the scent returned. Not from her, not from the air, from me. It started subtly. My pillow, my sweater, the inside of my wrist. That same soft, warm aroma that used to follow her like a secret. I stood in the middle of my apartment, in silence, in awe, and I whispered, "You're not gone, are you?" The room didn't answer, but my chest ached the way it did when she used to hug me and whisper, "Stay," like it was both a command and a prayer. She came again that evening. Didn't knock, just opened the door. We sat on the floor, tea between us, and after an hour of saying nothing, she said, "I think I used to love you." I looked at her, carefully, and asked, "Why do you think that?" "Because I've started missing you when you're still in the room." I didn't cry, not then, but later, when she fell asleep on my shoulder, breathing soft, hands curled like petals against her chest. I held her and said under my breath, "I never stopped." That night I dreamed of the old temple, but this time the throne was empty. The petals had grown back. The scent filled the space like memory. But there was no kneeling, no worship, just 2 cups of tea and 2 hands reaching across the table to meet again. The next morning she made breakfast. Burned toast, overboiled eggs, orange juice that tasted like it missed its true calling as a lemon. And yet, it was the best breakfast I'd ever had, because she did it for me. Not out of duty, not out of routine, just a quiet instinct, like something inside her whispered, "You've done this before." We ate in silence. The kind of silence you get only with someone whose company is so familiar, your body relaxes before your brain can catch up. She sipped tea, watched the window, then asked softly, "Did I used to laugh more?" I looked at her. "You still do." She shook her head. "No, I mean, before. Did I laugh like someone who didn't need to remember why?" I didn't know how to answer that. Because yes, she did. She laughed like starlight, like music sneaking out of an unopened jewelry box, like someone who thought the universe might be secretly hilarious. But now, her laughter had hesitation in it, like it wanted to be sure no one was watching. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small item, a ring, simple, smooth, no gem. She held it up. "This was under my pillow." I froze. I hadn't seen that ring since she took it off the night she asked me, "Do you think we'll always feel this much?" She never answered her own question. But I did. I said yes, and she smiled, then slipped the ring off. Said, "Good. I want to wear it again when I forget what love feels like." Apparently, she'd found it. "Does this mean something?" she asked now. I nodded. It meant everything. She studied it, then very slowly slipped it onto her finger and whispered, "I still don't know who I am." I took her hand. You're Iliya." She looked up, tears in her eyes. "And who were you to her?" I hesitated, then said, "Someone she ruined breakfast with, every Sunday." She smiled. It cracked slightly, like a foundation remembering it used to hold something sacred. Later that afternoon, we walked to the old temple. Not because we had to, but because she asked. "I want to see where it happened," she said. I asked her what it was. She shrugged. "Whatever made the world bow and me forget." We didn't speak on the way there, but our hands brushed once and didn't move apart. The temple was overgrown now. Petals had returned, but none glowed. The air smelled like weathered stone and wilted devotion. She stood in front of the cracked throne. Didn't approach, just looked at it, then at the walls, at the vines, at the broken chalice that once held the mist. "I don't remember any of it," she whispered. I nodded. "You erased it." "I must have had a reason." "You did." She turned to me. "Was it a good reason?" "It was the best reason I've ever hated." She sat on the edge of the dais, fingers tracing invisible patterns in the stone. "Can you tell me a story?" she asked. "About what?" "About me." So I told her, about the time she learned to cook using gravity spices and the entire kitchen floated for 3 hours. About how she once kissed me mid-sentence and said, "I just wanted to interrupt your doubt." About the day she cried while watching animated fish reunite on a kids' show and whispered, "Love should always look that simple." She listened, eyes closed, breathing slow, and then she whispered, "I feel like I love you." I smiled. "You do, but I shouldn't." "Why not?" "Because it feels like cheating." "Cheating on who?" She looked at me, tears ready. "On myself, on the version of me that let you go to save the world." I reached for her, not her hand, not her face, just her presence, and said, "That version of you was brave. This one is allowed to want things again." The wind changed. The petals rustled. A soft scent rose. Not hers, not the old perfume. Something new, something born from here, from now. She sniffed, paused. "It smells like beginnings." I nodded. "Maybe love isn't what we remember. Maybe it's what we build twice." She leaned against my shoulder. "You ever loved someone before me?" I turned, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Only you. Twice." It happened one night. No ceremony, no orchestration, just silence. Then her voice. "I remember." 3 words, spoken like raindrops finding a roof. I turned. She was standing in the doorway, hair down, wearing the oversized sweater she'd stolen months ago. Back when we thought forever was something you could hold in your hands without it slipping. Her eyes were glassy, and this time, not from confusion, not from dreams that didn't make sense, but from clarity. She walked to me, each step deliberate, each breath measured. She stopped just short of my arms, placed her hand over my heart, and whispered, "I don't remember every detail, but I remember the feeling." My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, but she lifted her finger. "Don't. Just let me." So I let her. "I remember sitting on your floor and thinking, why does this man make the room feel like it's listening to me? I remember tasting tea that made my throat ache with nostalgia I didn't earn. I remember reaching for your hand before I knew your name. And now, I remember why I let you go." She paused, not in pain, but reverence. "And why I came back." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small vial. Round, silver, empty. The one that started it all. "I thought I had to destroy this to be free," she said. "I didn't realize that freedom wasn't forgetting. It was choosing." She set the vial down on the table, uncorked it, and let the last remaining trace of the scent rise into the air. It didn't swirl, didn't glow, didn't command. It just was. Software. Gentle. Familiar. We sat in it, not as prisoner and rescuer, not as goddess and follower. Just 2 people who once collided under impossible stars and decided once more to hold on. Later that week, we returned to the old temple. The petals bloomed when she stepped in, but they didn't glow. They didn't whisper. The throne remained cracked, and she smiled at it. This place remembers more than I do. I nodded. She walked to the center of the room, sat down on the floor, cross-legged, peaceful. I joined her, and we stayed there for hours, not talking, not meditating, just breathing. And the temple pulsed, not like it did before. No worship, no bending walls, just the subtle rhythm of two hearts synchronizing again. That night we stargazed. I pointed to a constellation. You used to think that one looked like a fork. She laughed. I still do. You named it. What did I call it? Cutlarius Prime. She snorted. I was insufferable. You were divine. Then the stars shifted, just slightly, like they did once before. But this time no one bowed. Not even the trees, not even the air. Only her. She stood, faced the sky, and bowed. Slow, respectful, grateful. Then turned to me, took my hand, and whispered. They remembered me. But I remembered you. The next morning she woke up first, made toast, didn't burn it, made tea, let it steep the perfect amount of time, then sat beside me on the couch, offered a cup. I sipped, paused, and whispered, You still put too much lavender. She smiled, leaned in, and said, Maybe, but now you're addicted. And she was right. Later that day we packed, not to leave, but to stay better, to clean the space, replace what was worn, grow new things. We planted flowers on the temple steps. Iliya laughed when I accidentally watered my foot. I laughed when she tried to name the plants after moods again. We called one Regret. It bloomed pink. She looked at me, sunlight in her eyes, and said, I think we're doing it. Doing what? Loving each other, without forgetting who we are. I nodded. Third time's the charm. She grinned. Third? I leaned in. Once before the perfume, once through forgetting. And now, I kissed her. Long, software, uncompelled, uncommanded, pure choice. Then whispered, This is forever. If love survives memory, outlives power, and outshines the stars, then maybe, just maybe, it was never about remembering at all. Maybe it was always about choosing, again, and again, and again. If you've ever loved someone twice, tell me, because next time we begin a new story, and this time no one forgets.